Hello to our audience. I'm Tom Marks, the editor of Apollo magazine, and I'm delighted to be the moderator this stormy afternoon if you're in London, but probably bright morning if you're in California, for this London Art Week event, Dispelling the Myth About Works on Paper. And I'm looking forward to discovering what this myth is and why we're here to dispel it. I think above all, the idea that we're looking at this afternoon is the sense that works on paper have been considered perhaps the most fragile, vulnerable, sensitive types of artwork, and that somehow that has affected how they've been collected and displayed, and perhaps particularly in recent decades, and now how people are collecting and displaying them. So we'll be thinking about the history of display on works of paper, the history of conservation of works on paper, but we'll be also thinking about how new methods to store and frame and display these items has made them perhaps less vulnerable to the elements. We've got a wonderful panel who I'll introduce in a second. I'll just give you a sense of how I'm going to run this talk today, first of all. I've asked all of our speakers to provide a couple of images, 2 or 3 images, that will give some perspective on the subject at hand this afternoon. And I'm going to let each of them really introduce themselves in a way by talking through their images. After that, we're going to move into an open conversation about some of the subjects that I've outlined. And then towards the end of the hour that we've got allocated, we'll be taking questions. So if anyone in the audience would like at any time this afternoon to ask questions of our speakers, then please do use the Q&A box in the Zoom platform. I'll keep an eye out during the talk, and if I can fold any of those in, I will, but please do add them throughout the conversation so that we've got something to pose to our panel come the end of the hour. Our speakers today come from a variety of backgrounds and specialisms. We have Tom Edwards, who is the owner and managing director of Abbott Holder, who have been dealers in British pictures since 1936, and the gallery is based in Bloomsbury in London. We have Liberte Nuti, who is director with Florian Härb of Härb Nuti, who specialize in works on paper from the 16th century to the present day. Liberte was previously in the Christie's Impressionist and Modern department, and then later at Haus and Wirth Gallery. We have Jane McAusland, who began her career as a paper conservator back in the 1950s and 60s on Museum Street, just by the British Museum, set up her own workshop in 1970 in Chelsea, later moved to Suffolk in 1980, where she still has her studio today. And a great number of works on paper have passed through her hands in that time. Matthew Travers is the director of Piano Nobile Gallery, established by Robert Travers in 1985, based in Holland Park for 20 years, specializing in modern British art. So thank you all our speakers for joining us. I'm going to jump straight in to these images as promised. And I think, Tom, you are going to kick us off, and I'm going to hand straight over to you. Tell us about the images you've chosen.
Good evening, everyone. Hope you can hear me over the thunder. I've chosen these two really because I think both of them raise difficult and different issues about collecting, conservation, and display. The first is a fashion drawing by a man called Brian Stonehouse. It was made in the mid-1950s, probably for Vogue, the magazine he was contracted to at that time. It's interesting from a collector's point of view because fashion illustration is being taken more and more seriously all the time, so it's a burgeoning area of collecting. It's interesting from a conservation point of view because it is using two sorts of media. One, a very traditional one, gouache. The other, at that time, very new fiber tip pen. They are both, in their own way, volatile and can damage or fade very easily. But in this case, they haven't. The drawing was made as a working drawing, not for display at all, really, although it could have been reproduced in a magazine. So it's very much a working sheet, rough and ready. The edges, which are irregular in fact because the man Stonehouse had a fire at his studio in the 1960s and trimmed off the charred edges of his sheets. I'd also like us to think about this and other objects and their condition in relation to their history. Stonehouse was a special operations executive spy who was dropped into France in 1942 and captured within 4 months. He survived 4 concentration camps, including Saarbrücken and Dachau, from where he was liberated. So it might be interesting to think how an object and its physical nature relates to its history. He was a survivor. This drawing is a survivor. The second image, sorry, I'm zooming through, in a very different way, this is a much more traditional sort of picture and long established, the collecting of pastel portraits of the 18th century. They are considered quite rightly by many to be very fragile. But this one is in remarkably good condition, and it's in remarkably good condition and completely original condition. When I bought it, the frame had never been opened up, despite not benefiting from any modern conservation methods. It's always been displayed, and perhaps we can consider whether an object like this that has lasted despite not being subject to modern intervention, whether it should be left entirely as it is, or perhaps it should be then taken out and cared for in the ways that one might in a museum look after something now.
Very good.
Thanks, Tom. Is that still, I mean, I know we're not seeing it in its frame at the moment, but is it still then in its original frame? It's behind you.
Can you see me?
Yes.
There it is, in its original frame.
And you think it hasn't really been opened then, or
It hadn't
you've
until I
put
bought
new glass on it?
It hadn't been opened. It had its original backboard and tape on it. I did open it because I hoped to find out who it was. And in fact, on the back was written the identity of the sitter. So,
well, one of the things you've raised is this idea of survival, but I also think something interesting that has been thrown up that we might come back to is the question of edges. Perhaps this is something that's particularly interesting for me as someone who makes magazines, because actually the irregular edges on drawings and sheets of paper are rather unlike, on the whole, how we might choose to illustrate paintings in Apollo. And coming on to Matisse, I think later, we've got in trouble before with the Matisse estate for cropping 1 millimeter off the edge of a drawing when we published it. Anyhow, we're going to move on to Jane and ask you, Jane, if you can talk a little bit about the images that you've chosen.
Well, I have a large studio in the middle of Suffolk, and I'm thinking of three of the particular pieces of equipment that I need and have in the studio. So we'll start with the upper left, which is just a little bobby with the tools, some of the tools used for doing handwork, removing hinges, repairing, and backings from drawings and prints. Little weights, which are handy for holding down curling corners, and little water bottles and paste containers as well. A few rubbers, all necessary things for a paper conservator when it comes to cleaning surfaces and doing small tasks or larger tasks on drawings. Below that is an extraction cupboard for working on, say, sellotape removal using solvents. I'm using any chemical. Below this is the extraction cupboard for use when using chemicals that one shouldn't breathe in. And upper right is a light bank that I use for bleaching out stains in some black and white prints and drawings in black Indian ink and sometimes pencil that can be immersed in water. And bleached just using light with no chemicals other than just plain water with a slightly alkaline. And below that is ultrasonic moisture chamber for very gently moistening papers and works on paper for all kinds of purposes, before they're flattened, before they're lined sometimes, before they're worked on a suction table. And below this, there's another group coming up. Is that right, Tom? Another batch of photographs. This is sort of use of part of the wet area of the studio, drying racks before, and an assistant leaning over looking at a drawing. A little, you can see the cabinet open, two above, and I'm looking at a drawing in the ultrasonic moisture chamber. There's plenty of good light in the studio, and many other pieces of equipment, a big sink as well, and presses. So if anyone has any questions about what
Jane, I hope that we will have time to talk a little more about, I mean, it's sort of amazing to see these, what for me, obviously looking in, are the sort of gadgets and gizmos of your trade. And it's interesting to see, you know, for instance, your ultrasonic moisture chamber, yes, which I sort of wonder, it strikes me that perhaps certainly along with other developments in conservation work on other media, since probably in the last 40, 50 years, that the techniques must have changed a great deal. And in fact, that's something we will come on to when we get to the conversation. But is that true to say broadly?
Absolutely true. Yes, it's been fascinating doing the work so long, and so much has changed. And a lot of it's with big help from American research. Early on, I went to America on the Churchill Fellowship and saw all the conservators in my age group starting off with suction tables. I'd already knew about suction tables, but I hadn't got one at that stage. And then the ultrasonic came a bit later. And you can see in the corner there's a microscope that you can work under too. It's sort of up to times 100 and quite useful. Our conservators usually have them on poles that can run over big surfaces of oil paintings. And there's a light for taking photographs. This studio was built in 1985, and I must say now, if I was doing a new studio, I'd probably make it, this is about 1,000 square feet, but I would make it double that, because there are so many very large works around to conserve or restore, or generally sort of help along in life.
That's fascinating, and I won't ask you to come back on this. We'll move on to Liberte, but I suppose just one of the things I'm thinking about is that, you know, obviously there have been historically large works, you know, such as cartoons for larger paintings and so on. But it strikes me that, of course, as contemporary artists have made and post-war artists have made drawings on a grander scale, then the conservator needs to have more room to conserve the sheets and so on. Liberte, let me ask you about the two works that you've chosen, if you unmute.
Then I've chosen two works. The first you can see is by Henri Matisse, and the second one, which we can see later, is by Henri Mehr. André Mer. And they have two things in common. First, they are very large, maybe not large as you were mentioning for contemporary, but for modern work, they're quite large. The size of the sheet is about 55 by 60 centimeters. And that's the two things they have first thing they have in common. And the second thing they have in common is the artist has used a medium which is called charcoal, which is a medium I like very much because it allows the artist to work quickly. It's great for portraits, for example. It's also great for working on plein air or just catching the motif. And it allows the artist also to, if you press the charcoals, it can be very strong, the line, or it can be soft. And when you rub it, it creates this shadow and some volume, which you can see very much here in the head made by Matisse. This drawing was made, it's a commissioned portrait of Mrs. Paley. She was the wife of a collector and American businessman who created the network CBS. And he bought two Matisse paintings, then he commissioned the portrait of his wife to the artist. They went to Paris and she posed for him. And very often Matisse will kind of draw in the morning with different mediums. We'll start with charcoal, then he will do pencil, and then pen and ink to move to paintings. And he's done 8 of those. And you can see how free it is because he's really trying to capture what's the essence of the model. Unfortunately, the painting was never made because Matisse got ill. And after that, the schedule of the Paleys kind of didn't really match, and that was never done. Then that drawing, we can speak about the conservation. Both are in extremely good condition, which shows then drawing can go through the time. This one, the Matisse one, was made in 36. And the Mer was made in the early 60s. And the paper is very good. The medium is also as kind of hold very well. The plus with the charcoals is with the light and time, it doesn't fade. It really holds very well. The minus, I would say, for that medium, it's because it's powder, it can be quite volatile. I mean, you can't shake it too much, and very often artists have used fixative to fix it to the paper, or they've pressed it to also fix the powder to the paper.
Well, I hope there aren't too many collectors out there or curators who have Matisse drawings that they try to shake around too much to see how much will fall off them. But this is really interesting. One of the things I think I would very much like to come back to, if we have time, is this sense in which, okay, we're talking about a really huge field, works on paper, you know, everything from preparatory drawings through to very finished prints, through to potentially collages, you name it. But I suppose I just wonder whether the sense that some of these things were done quickly or fleetingly, that doesn't mean that necessarily we value them any the less. It may have been something that has contributed. Their sense that they were preparatory has sometimes contributed to the sense that they might be vulnerable or on the verge of being ephemeral if we don't look after them very carefully. Anyhow, I'm going to move on to Matthew, and you have picked, first of all, these Picasso images.
Yes, hi Tom, and thank you for that. Very interesting to hear what everyone has to say. So my first image is of a drawing from 1967 by Picasso, who, as we know, was notoriously prolific. One of the many things that made him such a great artist. And in fact, this is the 4th drawing on the 2nd of the 7th, 67, that Picasso made. In the corner next to the date, there's a little Roman numeral, number 4. And he would carefully coordinate and record what was being produced, particularly at this stage in his life, which is rather wonderful to think. Maybe in a morning, he produced 2 or 3 very beautiful drawings. And it has all the spontaneity in it, and kind of power and bravura of a great late Picasso, with wonderful figures and good line. But I didn't just choose it because it's a great drawing by a great artist. I also choose it because it's a great example of what Jane has been talking about. And as a gallery, we work with Jane McAusland and have done for many years. And this is an example of a work that has always been cared for and loved, but had and as time has changed, our understanding of how to look after drawings has changed. Had been put in a classic 60s mount, quite acidic, under glass, but not under museum glass, in a frame that was a bit rickety and not really appropriate for such a work. And you can see in the first image on the left, some staining coming through from the tabs, and sort of a discoloring in the paper. In fact, that was from the acid mount behind. And through Jane's experience and great skill, one is able to bring the work back to a new lease of life. And on the left, sorry, on the right, you can see it represented. Sorry, the first image is on the left. You can see the work represented. Jane's managed to rinse out the acidity from the paper, and not only does that improve its life expectancy by some amount, it also makes the paper much more subtle and not brittle, otherwise it's at risk of cracking. And of course then we've represented it in a kind of up-to-date museum conservation grade frame, under museum glass, a period style frame for Picasso drawing. And I think that's a wonderful example of how a works can transcend into the modern age and be carefully enjoyed at home, look very beautiful and stylish, but also be very safe and secure, not in terms of the work itself literally, but also in terms of its conservation and its stability moving forward. I think that's a good example of that. The second slide is of a very different type of work on paper. This is an extremely large work by Paul Arago that is 1.5 meters high and almost 2 meters wide. Jane wasn't so enthralled when I told her of the size of this for a condition report. And in fact, we didn't have to send it to her wonderful studio in order for her to look at it. But I think it's interesting going back to that idea, Tom, of works being studies or preparatory and in some way therefore less significant than a major finished piece. But and in Picasso's case, I think that's the case. A work on paper can just as easily have a integrity, a kind of a conceptual integrity to it, as much as a major oil painting. And that's what makes them so wonderful, because with that you get this spontaneity. But in this case, you see Arago using paper as her sort of preferred medium, really from quite early on in her career, and looking at ways to enhance it structurally, so she can produce things on this scale that are robust. And I hope the image on the right sort of shows the back of the paper, which we were pleased to see and had expected. Arago, particularly from the mid-80s and into the 90s, would apply the paper she wanted to work on to a very thin, or have it applied through a professional process, to a very thin cotton canvas. So it's actually pre-prepared paper cotton canvas. And if anyone has a chance to go and see her teacher, which I highly recommend, you'll see most of the works prepared this way, and in sometimes even they're then laid down onto a larger canvas, so a stretched canvas. I think it's a fascinating example of an artist, well, in this sense, the work itself is a very important part of her series, looking at fairy tales and Disney characters, but also an artist thinking about paper as a medium, wanting to use it on a larger scale, a more monumental level, scale, and thinking about structurally, from a technical point of view, how they can do that. And as I say, this work is in the hanging at the moment at the Tate show. So with many other very large scale works on paper, it's worth seeing if one has the opportunity.
Well, thank you to all our speakers for the images they've chosen. Matthew says something very interesting about the preparation of paper, insofar as I think it would be wonderful to find the time to talk about how far artists have that feeling of the potential deliquescence of what they're working with, or the potential obsolescence or the potential damage that might happen to it in time, and how they might be protecting against that. Similarly, with the work that Liberte showed, this feeling that how far a fixative might actually fix something, or how far it might cause different types of problems in the future. I'm going to stop sharing the screen so that I can see all of our speakers and start to move the ball around a little bit between them. Let me start, Tom. You're going to probably have to get up to unmute, I'm afraid, Tom Edwards, that is, because I wanted to ask you to come back to you. How far, in your experience, the premise of this event is a real or false one? Do you feel like there is a myth about works on paper in terms of how people really approach them with a feeling for their fragility?
Probably. The fact is that there are lots of factors to take into account with work on paper. They can be very fragile. But I think on the whole, that with the experience like you've got here on the panel, we can demonstrate that actually, as I said with the pastel to my left, fragile things can last very well for many hundreds of years, even without modern intervention. And those works which even on first appearance might seem on the face of it, I suppose, damaged or in bad condition, can be reversed very, very easily. It's amazing what can be done with works on paper. And it's amazing how they can be presented and contained now to make them last longer than perhaps, as you said, Matthew, they would have done when framed and mounted in the 1960s. I think perhaps less of a myth, it's more to do with confidence on the part of collectors. There are just so many factors to take into account, but I don't think necessarily any more than with an oil painting, which can be perhaps hiding far more problems than a work on paper does.
Jane, you will have seen many damaged or works on paper, whether by accident or design in your time. But I wondered whether you feel that, in a sense, it goes back to what we are looking at, the photos of your studio, whether you feel like the new technologies that have come into play to conserve works on paper, and perhaps a better understanding of how they should be conserved, means that, in a sense, we can be more confident in terms of how we display them, whether in a museum or in a private context, than perhaps we would have been 120 years ago, say.
Yes, I think the new technologies I mentioned earlier also in the actual processes relate to hands-on conservation and also preventive conservation has developed enormously. And also in museums for storage, lighting, general display. It's all a completely different world now, and for the good of art on paper, certainly. On the whole, I would say that. Yes.
Liberte, let me ask you about you handle works from the 16th century to the present day, and I suppose in some senses, certainly drawings, certainly prints, perhaps collage less so. It's probably a different beast in a way, but have been considered one of the most connoisseurial collecting categories, and a whole realm of works on paper, prints has developed, even focusing on that connoisseurial activity. I think of Daumier or somebody like that. I think about how I go into a museum. I still go into many museums in this country and others. And if I want to see drawings, there might be a big old cabinet with a heavy curtain on the top of it. And I have to lift that curtain up and discover this secret, but only if I know that already that I have to look under that curtain to discover that work on paper. I mean, do you think that that type of mode of display, in fact, even the fact that people would have kept these things in vast chests or files of prints rather than having them on display, sometimes has affected even how we think about works on paper?
Yeah, it's true. It's not the best way to show works on paper. It's very, very off-putting. Thanks God, we see less of that now. And very often in big museum, you will have a room, a section, which is dedicated to works on paper with a light which would be dimmed. They will be under glass. Like in Orsay, you have that. You have for Degas, which are quite fragile, but they are pastel. You have these kind of corridors with big glass, and then you can go through. The important thing is you need enough light to see them, and you need also to be able to go close to them because you want to see. And that's a challenge for museum, but I think there has been a lot of progress now. For more contemporary works, you do see them, like I haven't seen the Polarigo, but I'm sure there are a lot of works on paper on view. You can do a lot with glass, with the type of UV things you put on the glass, with the type of light you project on the drawing. There is a lot of things that museum can do, and also contemporary galleries are really working on. The climate control, a lot of galleries now have climate control, which helps a lot. Then hopefully the idea of going in a dark corner and lifting the corduroy or velvet red curtain will be over soon. That has this charm in a way, but not in a big contemporary space. Drawing are sensitive to light, and there is nothing you can do about that. But there is, I think, new buildings and the way glass is kind of the evolvement with glass. You can do a lot to protect your drawing.
Well, let me ask all of the panel off the back of what Liberte has said, which museums for them are presenting drawings in perhaps the most boldest or most innovative ways? Liberte, let me start with you because you are in full flow.
I guess in New York, you have the Drawing Center. You have a new drawing room in London. Who else does really good contemporary? Most of the big contemporary gallery have a room or are showing drawings, maybe not on a permanent basis. Maybe sometimes you need to give them a little of rest. And more traditional museum like Orsay or the Met or MoMA, they have kind of dedicated room, which works very well also.
Do any of our other speakers want to jump in? Really, what I should have asked you all is which museums seem to display their drawings in the worst way, but that would be naughty of me. Matthew.
I was going to say, Tom, I think there's maybe not the most contemporary way of showing things, but certainly the British Museum or the Courtaulds Prints and Drawing Rooms are, I think, very special places. And if people don't know them, the Courtaulds is a little difficult at the moment because it's shut, but certainly the BM, when it reopens properly to the public. What's wonderful about that is that anyone can go and request anything in their collection, and although it may not be on display most of the time, they will find a date and pull it out for you, and you can go and have a personal encounter with a Michelangelo drawing or a contemporary work, say a Frank Abbott 50s charcoal, or modern work in that case.
Tom
I'd
Edwards, you
like
would jump
to
in.
second that. That's exactly what I was going to say, and I think Matthew's absolutely right. The risk of playing devil's advocate, I think that as important as contemporary developments in display and conservation are, I think that it can be as sort of the equivalent of the big curtain, frankly, and nothing better than sitting in the BM Princeton Drawings Room with a drawing on an easel in front of you, and seeing it, as it is.
And that ability to get, because I think, what's wonderful partly about works on paper, of course, not all works on paper, you can't generalize, but so many of them is that spontaneity, that connection to the artist's hand, that moment that it was created, often quite a quick moment, and to therefore to have a close encounter with that sort of work. Sometimes at the BM, even without potentially a frame even on the work, is an amazing experience, and one that people should try and enjoy if they can.
So I'm going to come to Jane, but ask her a different question, because Matthew, you said there, well, obviously we can't generalize about works on paper, and we've already seen an ink drawing, we've seen a pastel, we've seen charcoal works, we've seen something with a fiber tip pen and gouache. I mean, Jane, it's interesting for me that there's a realm of work which is a paper conservator, and the one thing all of these things have in common is paper, although obviously people can draw on other supports as well. I mean, what is it that, is it the paper that these works share that gives us this sense that they are also sensitive to light, that they are also sensitive to damage?
No, not at all. It's a mixture. I mean, it's both. It's paper and, more importantly, really, and more delicately, more vulnerable is the medium, usually. Not all the time. We've got carbon ink, pretty sound, but the medium has to be taken into account first, I think, really. Papers are very complicated. If they're made with pure linen, for instance, they're absolutely perfect. And like all the early Italian drawings in the Royal Library, they will last for centuries because they've got no acidity and they've got no wood pulp in them or other vegetable fibres that have natural acidity, which will actually destroy the paper. You see, it will crack up slowly over the years with light, heat, pollution, damp, other agents that are very invasive and all around, really, all around the Princeton Drawings, in our atmosphere. And I think that it's if the paper's very pure and the paper's not so pure, the paper will just colour slightly, even they would appear rather like the Picasso had. So discoloration is quite bad for Princeton drawings because the contrasts of, say, tones of watercolour or washes of inks and things will actually probably fade a bit. Some of them, I mean, artists rather careful about, some artists anyway these days are careful about what type of paint and watercolor paint and inks and other pigments they use, and they do test them themselves by putting samples up against the light and windows. I've seen this with David Hopkins, and he even said to me the other day he was testing out his it's all been tested, he said to me, the iPad watercolor, all the iPad drawings that he's doing at the moment, which I think is I'm happy to hear that.
Don't tell me you've set up a new studio for conserving iPads. Not yet. I think that's for the Apple shop. But let me go back to Liberte, because you had a drawing which André Maire had used a fixative on, and just to pick up this point that Jane has been talking about. I mean, with the works that you handle, again, we're talking about possibly huge generalizations, but are there some artists for whom you feel they've had a greater feeling for how they might be preserving works on paper for posterity, whereas others might have just thought, okay, this is a scrap from the studio, but collectors have decided that they need to preserve them.
Yes, absolutely. You have some artists like Picasso or Matisse who are using the drawing as a medium, and they enjoy it and they sign it and they want people to collect them, and they are recorded in their archive, and there are some books about it, and they kind of they really kind of use the medium for what it is. And some other artists, like if you take Monet, for example, he wanted to be seen as a painter, and he's destroyed most of his drawings, and he's done some wonderful pastel, and there are still some around, but it's not kind of pushed toward that. And I'm sure, you know, this is not something he's kind of worked on and make sure it was well collected and well looked after. It was more destroying them than keeping them. Then I think it just depends how the artist is positioning himself, what he likes to do in his practice, and how he works on paper. Should it be prints or drawing? Because some artists are really using the medium print, which is completely different than drawing, or even like watercolor is another type of work. Then what's wonderful is when the artist kind of really use the medium for what it is and makes huge progress on it. Like I'm thinking of a painter like Emil Nolde, which is a great painter, but he has also developed a very unique way of doing watercolors, and that's kind of one realm of his earth. Very important, and I'm sure he had a special studio for that. He had some special paint, and then he had some special collectors, and there is a way to keep them, these drawings, these watercolors, for example.
It's very interesting, this suggestion that I suppose that particularly drawing and even some print methods, because of somehow the directness of the instrument. I mean, certainly with drawing, we always talk about it as one of the most direct mediums, but that you mentioned that there's a kind of individualism to it, and that seems to be true to me with a lot of 19th century art, but of course it's also about cultural moments. And you think about in 17th century, an artist like Federico Barocci perhaps would have created some drawings after having created paintings as collectible items off the back of works that he'd already made. Whereas if you think about Spain in the same time, there are very few presentation drawings, as it were, but although some occasionally are coming to the market now. So there are kind of cultural distinctions between times when drawings have been prized by certain collectors in certain places. Moving on to talk about collecting, before I come to some of the questions, I wonder, Tom, whether you might sort of comment on this idea. We've been talking about both real fragility and perceived fragility. We've been talking about how certain new technologies and more knowledge of media have allowed people to collect perhaps with more confidence. But do you think this myth that we're discussing, does that sometimes put off perhaps inexperienced collectors from buying works on paper? And how can you reassure them if that does?
I don't know if it does. I mean, I don't get cited for people who are put off, I suppose, but so many people seem to start their collections places like mine, where they can come and see lots of things. They can really get a feel of the object, look at the backs as well as the fronts, and ask questions. And I think on the whole, people are far more brave than you might think. I think it's down to us to give people a lot of the confidence. We should, as members of the trade, be able to ask difficult questions and give people direct and honest answers. I think that the answers aren't always clear cut, but I do think people are a little bit more confident than perhaps you think. And I think the fashion drawing I showed is a good example of that. people are taking up great interest in these things, which, in relation to what Liberte was saying, they weren't really ever intended with a view to them being displayed, but people can understand that, and the right presentation and the right mounting framing, they seem quite happy to
well, let me put this another way, and first of all, I'll ask it to all three dealers on the panel, and then I'll ask Jane to comment as well. Do you think we'll go? I can see Tom, Liberte, and Matthew in order on my screen, so I'll ask it in that order. You know, if a potential client came into the gallery, you know, is there anything that you would say to them, any work that you've handled where they might ask you the question, but is it okay for me to hang it on my wall? Will it be okay? That you would say, well, maybe you shouldn't, or maybe you should only have it on your wall in a dark room or for 3 months or something. Tom first.
No, I think that if they couldn't hang it, I wouldn't be selling it. It was so fragile. I think unless by its nature it's an album or something which belongs in a drawer and can't be presented, I think I would say that's pretty. I can be pretty confident on that. And certainly we give people advice on the hanging of pictures, and what we were saying about museum treatments of things, talking about humidity or light and UV. We do that naturally at home, you know, that not hanging things over a radiator and pointing at a south-facing window, choosing to put things out of the way of great fluctuations in temperature and not facing the window. That in itself is very much what the museums are doing in a less technical way. So there's lots of decisions you can make hanging pictures in the home, which will help the work on paper. Absolutely.
Liberte, same question for you.
Well, I think here we are speaking mostly about problems, but honestly, works on paper, as Jane was saying, you know, their paper is really, really sturdy. And when you think of the Egyptian papyrus and all these things, which, you know, they've gone through ages, and you should not be too afraid. Now, if you want to put them in your home, there are some very, very simple rules you have to follow, and no direct light. Of course, no humidity, but you would not put your painting outside either. And that's it, you know, and then of course you have to know the medium. If it's a watercolor, this is more fugitive, and that I would not really display all the time in my home for sure. The rest it's fine, but paper is sensitive to light. That's rule number one, and you just have to be a bit careful. But I would not be more scared than that, honestly.
I need you guys to come around and help me with this Edward Lear drawing that I keep in a cupboard, because I only bring it out to show people when they come round, because I'm too afraid of it, of the ink going. Well, I'll give Jane some work perhaps if I put it in direct light.
Your curtain, and you know, some people like that also, I think, but otherwise don't be afraid, enjoy it.
Matthew.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with Tom and Liberte, Tom, on most of these issues. And yeah, it's something we discuss all the time with people, and they say, oh, you know, where is it okay to hang it, and where should I put it? And you know, firstly, I suppose we as an organisation, as a gallery, try and mitigate as much of this risk, or if you can call it a risk for people, by making sure things are presented to a very high standard. You know, and obviously in terms of thinking about light protection from light, you know, good UV glass and non-reflective that's aesthetically helpful, but the UV protection can really reduce light damage, or the potential for light damage, well into the 90%, 96, 98%. And also things are to be loved and enjoyed. And I think if they've lasted long enough and are looked after, you know, carefully, as says, maybe don't hang it outside on your terrace or in a bathroom, then there is never going to be a problem. There have been to one or two houses actually where I've probably been more nervous than the owners, and I can think of going to see one client in particular who had an amazing collection, and in their bathroom, which was regularly used and probably got quite steamy, in their shower room, they had two very important watercolours, admittedly under glass, hanging in their bathroom, and they had been there for probably 25 years and were absolutely fine. So, you know, I think again, you know, when you have something at home, you have it to enjoy it and live with it. Of course, the museum.
While you're having a shower, I mean, I would say that the bathroom is for your bronze sculptures. Jane, let me ask you whether you've heard our other guests speak about sort of the advice they might give to collectors. But I mean, do you ever worry about things even after you've handled them going back on display?
All the time. It's what I'm doing. I did a little pamphlet was published by Sotheby's actually in about 84 or something like that. I think that I did, and they sent out with all their monthly magazines. And there was all the enemies of art on paper, really. And clients often ask me about which frame is a good frame, or which boards should we use, and what glazing, and all the rest of it. And I always love, giving one of these pamphlets and telling them exactly why it's important to have conservation boards, UV protected glazing, sealing in everything very carefully and properly, especially like art on paper like pastels, which are so very delicate. And I don't like the idea of anything that's passed through my hands becoming sort of more damaged, again, by bad display and storage of the owners, that it's going to looking after it down the century. I think not ahead. Is it going to last for 100 years? And have I done my best for it?
I promised that we'd answer some of these questions. I think we've touched on some of them, but I'm going to just try and zip through them. If we try and keep the answers snappy, we've only got about 10 minutes left. Let me ask, first of all, this question about, have any of you, perhaps put your hand up if you have handled complete artist sketchbooks, and how you've talked to collectors about displaying or viewing such objects? Jane, have you? You have, yes, and Tom. So Jane, yes.
Yes. I think boxing is important for these in the home, and perhaps in museums as well. Proper good conservation boxing, and if I think anyone in a domestic scene wants to show them, then it's if we have them nicely stored and bring them out to show people, and take great care of how you handle them. So they're ever protected and not displayed. And obviously, in the museum, you have little special display areas for such things. Yeah.
Tom, you had a sketchbook as well?
It's very difficult. Almost all the sketchbooks that are sold, I think they're institutional things, really. There is another category, and that's albums, things that are stuck into bound books, but that's another issue. I think with it's very difficult, I can see, for collectors to understand and to want to have sketchbooks in the drawers, unless they're real fanatics, and then they're almost museums in their own right.
A question here I'm going to ask Liberte, which is partly because you showed a preparatory drawing and I think a finished drawing as well, and the question is really about whether there's a market, or whether collectors divide between people who might only want things that were conceived of as being finished and things that were working drawings or sketches. Do you find that, Liberte, in terms of clients, that people divide over the type of drawing?
Yeah, but I think you have, in terms of value, you have the sketch, which is a small thing, which can belong to an album. Often it's not signed. And then you have the much bigger one, which is like the Matisse I've showed, or the Mer, which are signed. They are finished works of art, and there is a difference in value. And then the sketch, you might just catch a moment. Generally, the finished drawing, it will be like a finished product, and there is a big difference, yeah, which you can see with your eyes.
Matthew, same question for you.
Yes, I suppose in the end that there is a difference. Of course, if a work is signed and is conceived as a in itself as an entity, perhaps it has a higher value than something that isn't. But I think that's inherent to each work. It's hard to generalize. Some things that aren't signed, are just as finished as things that are. And sometimes the most brief and sort of scrappiest of drawings can command great values because of exactly that, because of their charm and that closeness you have to the artist's creative process, which I think is rather amazing. I think it's also going back to the other point about sketchbooks. I handled relatively recently a sketchbook by an artist called Peter Coker, and a lot of artists, of course, think in these terms, knowing that their books might be dispersed, or for people to be able to see the works, enjoy them on their wall. He would actually ingeniously have his sketchbooks bound specifically, so at the cut of 2 strings at the back, they were designed this way. They could, after he had completed one, they would fold open, and the sheets would reveal themselves as finished flat works, which was rather amazing. And I think one must never underestimate the kind of an artist's ingenuity and kind of ability to of the importance of works on paper or drawings or sketches within their oeuvre. I think it's.
I promised we'd end at 6, so I'm going to ask just one more question, which is going to go to in Jane's direction, because I think it's a lovely question to have in the box, which is from a practicing artist, and they work only on paper as a printmaker, drawer in drawing and in mixed media, and they want to ask, what recommendations could you make to us for considering lengthening the life of our works?
Well, how large are they for a start? Are they very large ones?
We don't have that answer. Maybe it will come in the 2 minutes we have. But in general, what do you say to artists if they're worried about enduring?
Yes, they are concerned about it, some of them, but there has been a school of not worrying too much what happens to them, in fact. And almost, they're sort of like their children, and so some of them they hope will grow up and people will enjoy and look after properly. But there's a completely mixture of types of artists, who really don't. In fact, they're sort of almost disposable objects. So it's a philosophy. It's all part of philosophy, really, of art.
These are small works, 30 by 40, 40 by 50 centimeters.
Yeah. Oh, well, I would say to tell people, that, well, in fact, just paper generally, and what is the medium on these works?
I think for this answer, we're going to have to ask the artist in question to contact you. But this is what such events allow for: conversation and the continuation of conversations. We are at the end of our allotted hour. So it remains for me to say thank you very much to our speakers today, to Tom Edwards, to Liberte Nuti, to Matthew Travers, and to Jane McAusland. I've been Tom Marks. I'm the editor of Apollo magazine, and London Art Week continues. And I wish I was able to tell you when it continues until, but perhaps one of our other speakers until Friday. But the reason I don't know is because you should always be going to the galleries in Mayfair and St James's and elsewhere in London when you can. But there are some wonderful exhibitions happening both in physical spaces and online. So thank you all very much for joining us, and I hope you enjoyed our event this evening. Good night.
Thank you.